An Archaeodeath publication review.
Hey Archaeodeath fans, it's Professor Howard Williams here again, and this time I'm doing one of my reviews of past publications. I'm taking you way back in time, back to the early days of my career, to one of my first books, my first edited collection. It is actually my first edited collection proper, having edited a special issue of World Archaeology in 1998. My first job as an archaeologist at Trinity College Carmarthen, I was keen to organise conferences and build a sort of platform for myself and for other scholars interested in the archaeology of death and memory. And I did so by editing a collection. So this, having done a sort of journal special issue, this was my first edited book. And I actually developed this from a conference, and this is for younger scholars thinking about this. The importance of organising conferences and conference sessions on the theme that you get to choose is you can really set the agenda for what people are discussing, and people will be keen if you pick a good topic. If you pick a topic that's timely and pertinent, you will draw in and attract people that you expected and knew, and people whose work you already knew, other PhD students and other early career scholars who perhaps you weren't even aware of before. You'll be able to network, but also you'll be able to hear the latest stuff on your field, on your period. So it's great for learning, it's great for networking, the conference session is a great way to connect and build new agendas, to develop perspectives that cross-cut perhaps different regions, different periods of time where specialists might be in their own niche, regional geographical conferences or period conferences, or perhaps a theoretical or methodological dimension, and they might not talk to each other. So the session of a conference can be a key way you draw together those different expertise, those different perspectives into an event. And that event needn't go forward to publication. And it may be, and I learned this with my very first couple of edited collections, both the World Archaeology and this book that I'm going to talk about today, you have to select. Some people won't be interested in publishing, others will be interested in publishing, but their work wasn't quite what you were looking for. Doesn't mean it was bad work, it just might not be actually as focused on the theme, or it may be tackling a different theme that was equally valid, but it wasn't particularly what you wanted to get out of the session. Now, for my first edited book called Archaeologies of Remembrance, Death and Memory in Past Societies, published by Kluwer Plenum, and Kluwer Plenum now a Springer. It's a big international science publishers. This book is still available. It's a hardback only, and it always has been, and has remained in that format. And this came out in 2003. And for me, it was very much about taking forward and experimenting with something I'd never done before. Never edited a book, never pulled together other people's work into a coherent form. And it came from a University of Oxford tag session in 2000, I think it was. So it took 3 years, 3 years to edit it together. And the contents of this edited collection are quite varied. And the conference session at Oxford is reflected in this book. It's reflected in some of the individual authors, but also reflected in the fact that it's a book that deliberately was trying to look across periods of time, not to be another book that is a ghetto of prehistorians with one token medievalist or Romanist. And equally, it was intended to ensure that there were later medieval, post-medieval and contemporary archaeology. Back in the noughties, this was really new stuff, contemporary archaeology. So I wanted to make sure there was a broad spectrum of chronology. And as far as my network, and it was an Oxford event, so there's a geographical bias, that we wanted as much geographical range as possible, but inevitably almost all of the contributors are British and Northwest European in their focus in this collection. Now, the book is not without its flaws, and the reviewers of the book picked out some issues with it, including the fact that I must admit, even though I knew I would be largely on my own with editing it, I had thought, as with my earlier journal articles and books, that there would be some kind of oversight by the publishers. And I did the best I could with formatting, but it's really not professionally of standard. And that is the problem with Springer, is that it's as close as you get to self-publishing, but with a massive price tag attached to it. And nowadays, of course, I would not be looking to publish with Springer for this kind of book with such low quality support and editorial guidance. I really felt I was let down in the years afterwards by this book, not only because of the high excessive cost of the volume, but that matched with, that's okay at one level if you're getting a very high quality copy editing, typesetting work done for you, but no, I had to do it all, everything. So there's a lot of errors in this book. There's a lot of the prose and the style and the structure are not professional, and I can only blame myself, but I also say that I wasn't really helped by the publishers at all. I can't therefore recommend this experience on anyone else, and that is not the experience I felt with other publishers. There's been a lot of generalisation, but there's a lot of good publishers out there. But those points aside, it's never been a cheap book. It hasn't sold many copies beyond libraries, and it hasn't really had the impact that I'd hoped it would because of that. And it came out and coincided with a Blackwell's volume, which is much more international, by Ruth Van Dyke and Sue Alcock, which called Archaeologies of Memory, which went to paperback. It was in paperback and sold like hotcakes in comparison. So this book was kind of more established archaeologist than I had got there in the same year of 2003 with a very interesting far-ranging collection, and this book kind of languished in relation to that, but really that was outside of my control and abilities to manage. Those are the critical points: the production quality, the price, the experience. As a new editor of a collection, I learned a lot. I made a lot of mistakes and I learned a lot along the way. Having said that, I am quite proud of it because it has set me up as an agenda I took forward 3 years later with my own monograph in 2006, and subsequently with a series of journal articles, book chapters, looking at archaeologies of remembrance from the early Middle Ages and into the contemporary world. And that's a lot of my work subsequently has sort of jumped between the 20th, 21st centuries and the 5th to 11th centuries AD. Let me take you through some of the contents. First of all, there is an introduction by myself. I was at Trinity College Carmarthen when I edited it, but I jumped to a one-year position. It was a 2-year position at Cardiff University. So the book came out with my Cardiff affiliation now. Look at that. That's a blast from the past. I ended up being there for a year before I jumped to another job that was permanent, or promised to be permanent. But I really enjoyed my time at Cardiff in many regards, and Cardiff got this book with my affiliation attached to it for their trouble of giving me a position for promised 2 years, but I left after a year. I was replaced by a chap called Dr. Joe Flatman for the second year. People might not have heard of him. Anyway, in that first year, in that 1 year at Cardiff, the book came out, and the chapters reflect my contacts, particularly at Cardiff and Reading. I had a lot of research contacts, and also Oxford and Southampton and the Open University, and so on to other places too, and one of my colleagues at Trinity College Carmarthen. So we had an introduction by me, and in that introduction I do survey historical, archaeological and anthropological approaches to memory, and put forward some specific archaeological perspectives, and I cite prehistoric, early historic and later Middle Ages to the present day approaches to memory and death, in particular looking at funerary archaeology and memory theory. And I think that's still a useful introduction, a bit descriptive, but it does really set the stage. We then have a chapter by Vicky Cummings, now professor at UCLan, but then at Cardiff University, wrapping up her PhD research looking at Neolithic monuments in Western Britain, and a paper is about building from memory, remembering the past at Neolithic monuments in Western Britain. And so her case study sort of draws on and reflects and takes forward some of her ideas about the Welsh monuments. So she looks at Cerrig Coed and Arthur, for example, and issues of symmetry and landscape context, and how these tombs may be remembering or evoking senses of past in their construction. Complementing that, then at the University of Manchester, now at Newcastle, Chris Fowler has a paper looking at drawing on his ongoing work there just before his publication of the Archaeology of Personhood, a very influential text. Chris's paper, Rates of Exchange, Death and Growth, Memory and the Transformation of the Dead in the Early Neolithic of Southern Britain, early Neolithic Southern Britain, really takes a really interesting approach to tempos of decay, looking at the exchange of objects and human-animal transformations within these megalithic and earthen architectures, and looking at remembering and forgetting in the dynamic of monument building and use. A really exciting paper. So Vicky and Chris's Neolithic papers are complemented by then just brand newly arrived at the University of Southampton, if I recall, Andy Jones, who had done his PhD work at Glasgow. Technologies of Remembrance, Memory, Materiality and Identity in Early Bronze Age Scotland. And Andy is known for his work on the Bronze Age and the Neolithic. But this paper is a real mind blast of ideas about memory and metaphor, technologies of remembrance, an idea that really inspired my work, as many of you will know, looking at the variation in cremation and inhumation practices at stone circles, looking at Templewood in the Kilmartin Valley, for example, looking at Chapelden in the Aberdeenshire Kist burial, and looking also at rock art. So his chapter is really interesting, looking at the practice of memory and the creation of narratives through the carving, building, constructing spaces for the living and the dead to interact. Mike Williams, then at Reading University, has a chapter called Tales from the Dead, Remembering the Bog Bodies in the Iron Age of Northwestern Europe. So he looks at the issue of social memory, but for the exceptional dead, and it evaluates how we think about the sort of the striking, memorable, violent deaths meted out to some of the individuals we find surviving in bogs from Ireland, England and southern Scandinavia, including Boromasa Man, and some of the famous ones, Elling Woman and Winderby Girl and the Worsley Man and so on, and Lindo, obviously. So he looks at the violence and the multiple stages of their killing and sees them in terms of light bulb memories, as a creation of a striking and unforgettable demise before they're placed under the bog. So it's a very interesting chapter about how short term, there's no monuments placed necessarily that people would have remembered, but putting encapsulating or capping the dead in place. So we have those four exciting chapters from European prehistory, and particularly from the prehistoric archaeology of the island of Britain. And then we move into the ancient world, and Valerie M. Hope of the Open University gives us a chapter on remembering Rome, memory, funerary monuments and the Roman soldier. So she takes forward her exciting research on the remembrance through tombstones, looking at the relationship of ritual, textual and visual remembrance, and looking at Roman funerary memorials as a case study, looking at the Legio II Augusta as a case study, looking at Caerleon. So there we have another case of how we can look at text, image and materiality, the interaction of the monument with text and image in understanding how monuments work to project an identity and commemoration of the dead. And from there we move into the early Middle Ages. Hella Eckhart and myself do a co-authored piece of work. Hella at the time was at the University of Leicester. She'd done a PhD at Reading went to Leicester and then came back to Reading, where she still is a real force of good on many fronts in Roman archaeology. And Helen's chapter with me here looks at Roman objects but in an early Anglo-Saxon graves, taking forward and reflecting on the influential work of Dr. Roger White on that topic. And we try to make the point that rather than remembering Rome, a lot of these old objects were actually not necessarily about prestige and power and a church, but perhaps objects had a power because they were forgotten, because they had no known biography. And their mortuary context of deposition may be about sort of remembering through the fact that their origins are forgotten, which is, I think, an idea that is still influential and interesting when thinking about old things reused in new contexts. We then go to Western Britain and look at the issue of the multiple stages in which early medieval inscribed stone monuments, carved stones in Ogham and Latin text, how they have biographies. And Gareth Longdon, a colleague then at Trinity College Carmarthen, looks at the addition, appending of crosses to some of these early inscribed stones from West Wales. So he looks at the Clydai, Pembrokeshire monuments, and he also looks at the Vortigern stone and all these other monuments, and suggests that maybe they're having sort of crosses added to them at a time when people didn't know whether the original monuments were Christian. Whether they had been Christian or not, we don't know, or perceived as such, but they became seen as non-Christian perhaps and needed to be re-Christianised. We then have David Petts, keep staying with early medieval Wales, and David I've known since PhD days at Reading, and he's now a professor at Durham University, but then he was at Northumberland County Council for a spate, and his chapter Memories in Stones, Changing Strategies and Contexts of Remembrance in Early Medieval Wales, and he very much looks at the contrast between Group 1 stones, Group 2 stones, and then Group 3 stones through the early medieval period, and the different ways in which they would have worked as commemorative monuments. And looking at the relationship in particular between burial land and mortuary commemoration, as well as changing conceptions of death. And he does frame the change into the Group 3 stones, the end of the early Middle Ages, as a time of changing conceptions of death and the dead, influenced by European models. Our final chapter on early medieval archaeology is Victoria Thompson, looking at memory, salvation and ambiguity, a consideration of some Anglo-Scandinavian gravestones from York. And in this paper, Victoria, as this precedes her book, just about precedes her very influential book, she looks at York Minster 38 with its winged beasts in particular, and thinks about literary context, explain the dragons that wrap around and create crosses on these gravestones as protective symbols and symbols of faith, both of which help to articulate their role in remembrance. Now, I must admit I had a gap and couldn't fill it for the later Middle Ages, so I composed a chapter of my own, and this has been one of the few embarkations I've made into later medieval mortuary archaeology. This preceded by 2 years, perhaps the most influential study of this period, Barney Sloane and Roberta Gilchrist's book on Requiem. And in this chapter, which actually Roberta is very generously cited and republished in a more recent edited collection, which I am very flattered by, I try to put out present how we can think in new ways about the relationship between burials, tomb building, and the fabric of monastic churches in England. And my case studies, looking at the influential and important work at Bawdsley Abbey, looking at Sandwell Priory as another example, and also looking at the relationship between burial and the church architecture at the Greyfriars in Carmarthen. I make an argument that we can see, at least in part, in the close packed burials, the relationship between floor levels and the architecture are very close, dynamic, a tempo of interaction between construction and commemoration. Now, that takes us through the later Middle Ages, but there are two further chapters we need to quickly review. Professor Bonnie Effros, then of State University of New York in Binghamton, but now of the University of Liverpool, just down the road from me now, produced a wonderful paper looking at memories of the early medieval past, not in terms of how people in the early Middle Ages remembered their past, but in terms of how 19th century constructions of the early Middle Ages transpired, looking in comparative terms at how grave artefacts were deployed in 19th century France and early 20th century America. So she sees how grave goods from the Merovingian cemeteries of northern France, Belgium, Western Germany, and that kind of region are deployed in creating stories and histories within the 19th and early 20th centuries as part of national stories, but also international stories of origins. And also at the very end of the book, we have a wonderful chapter to end everything off. The only time I've actually published a chapter in Swedish, Dista Stordösen, the title is. This is by Cornelius Holtzoff, who then was employed by the Riksantikvarieämbetet, who was at that point employed by the Riksantikvarieämbetet in Stockholm, looking at a megalithic tomb on the west coast of Sweden that is associated with a memorial to the archaeologist who died excavating it. The capstone fell and collapsed and killed him, Wilhelm Ekman. And it takes a story through Ekman's grave. It takes you back from his grave to the unveiling of the memorial to memorialise him on the site, back to the excavations themselves of the monument in the very beginnings of the very beginning of the 20th century. And he reflects on the ways in which megaliths interact with 20th century archaeological projects. Ekman died in 1915, and Holtzoff reflects on his visiting of the site, and that therefore brings the story of memory and the power of the archaeological monuments we investigate right up into the 20th and 21st century. And that's been an inspiration for me to explore also 20th and 21st century evocations and reuses of the prehistoric and early historic past. So the book contains a rich range of case studies for you to read that would help anybody understand why archaeologists look at the past in the past, how ancient societies, prehistoric, ancient, medieval, modern societies deploy ancient monuments and sites, material cultures and graves to create their own senses of place and memory and identity. And that really is what I've taken forward in my own research in a variety of ways. And in addition to the benefits I've already mentioned about bringing an edited collection together, the ability to invite scholars you already know, but also meet many scholars you don't know, synergize, cross-fertilize ideas, and the experience you learn of creating the agenda, or at least partially creating the agenda, of taking forward ideas. I would also say that you make friends and you make connections that stay with you down the years. Now, I have my reservations, I've already cited about this book, but I remain proud of it in many ways, and it has an intellectual merit within the developing investigations of the past in the past and mortuary archaeology. And I would like to see it available in a cheaper, more accessible form. I've tried to pursue this with Springer, but unfortunately they're resistant to the idea. Even though 17 years on, they will not bring it out in paperback. They will not revise it to allow me to amend any of the mistakes in here, because I could spend a month or two really tarting this up and making it refreshing it with a new introduction, reflecting on work over the last 17 years that augments and challenges some of the work in here. But no, they don't want that. But despite that, I think it has an important place on my shelf, and I think anyone who's interested in studying mortuary archaeology and archaeologies of memory should get hold of this and utilise it. I hope this video has been very useful for you to give you an introduction to a not so recent book, but one that I think has been very influential. I think that there are new works coming out all the time, journal articles, book chapters that address these themes and take them forward, and I can't review all of that work in this video, but I think by giving you this introduction in a single video, doing a survey of this book, it adds to my other videos that also review my past books, so you can get almost like a video version introduction to work I've edited and work I've been writing, and almost get a lot of storybook version of some of the rationales behind how they were made and some of the mistakes or the things I perceive as mistakes or limitations with the study. If I was doing this today, I'd perhaps have a lot more papers on the 20th, 21st century. I'd have a lot more research on the later Middle Ages and the early modern period, and all those centuries in between, which are only still now getting their own edited collections, as well as continuing to. There's many edited collection on prehistory, but I think there's increasing numbers of historic period edited collections that came after this. But you know what? It has its limitations. There's a geographical span that could have been augmented. There's another whole couple of books one could do with South American, North American, African, Southeast Asian, Siberian, Central Asian, Polynesian, Melanesian case studies. You could make a massive encyclopedia of death and memory if you wanted to, but I think that might be for someone else to take on as a task. But for all its limitations, it stands as my first edited collection, and I'm very proud and pleased of it in so many ways, and I'm still grateful to many of the authors, some of whom I'm still in touch with, for all the hard work they put into helping me make it the book that it was.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the ArchaeoDeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.